So I want to speak about some of these insight factors that are related to these qualities. Let's think about Mettā, this Pali word Mettā. I must say, not well translated as loving kindness. Okay? And I really feel it's important to make that correction. Mettā has its roots in the Pali word Maitri, which is to befriend or to be a friend to. It has a roots in an earlier word which means to spread out with kindness or to grow fat with kindness, actually more literally. Now the reason why I think it's important to make that adjustment inwardly out of the phrase loving kindness is because you don't have to love something in order to be kind. You know? And I think when we hear that translation of loving kindness, it can trigger all kinds of things in people of thinking, well, I'm supposed to be loving towards, this really unacceptable situation in my life, or I'm supposed to be loving towards this chronic pain or this chronic illness. You don't actually have to love something in order to befriend it. But you can begin to give up the aversion and the ill will and the fear of it. We're even learning to befriend aversion, even learning to befriend ill will with curiosity and care. So don't think of these as, if ill will is present, there's no Mettā. If Mettā is present, there's no ill will. No, we're actually learning to befriend that most difficult pattern of ill will, which is the root of so much, isn't it? Impatience, frustration, comparing, blame, shame, judgment, and you think about what it produces in our world, ill will. What it produces in our world, ill will. Last night when I was putting my young grandson to bed, he was speaking about Ukraine, and he said, "What is the point of war?" He said, "What is the point of war?" He said, why do people do this? And I thought, well, that's a pretty pertinent question. It's a pretty relevant question. But we see, don't we, the power of ill will. We see it in our society, we see it in our relationships. We see it in our relationship to ourselves, and we see it in all of the systemic isms that can permeate our cultures. Ill will is a toxic power. I think it was the Greeks, a Greek philosopher once said, holding on to ill will is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemy to die. It's toxic for our systems. It's toxic for our world. So Mettā, this quality of boundless friendliness, kindness, is very much concerned with this divisive pattern. And, we're not talking about, the fierce outbursts of rage. We're talking about these many small moments that can happen in our day when things are just not the way we think they should be or need to be in order for us to be happy. My coffee's at the wrong temperature, or the bus is late, or, someone's too noisy, or they've forgotten to turn off their phone, or, all these small moments where you just hear that narrative, don't you? You just hear that story, What is the outcome? What is the outcome? Very rarely. And I'm not talking about wholesome response to the unacceptable here. I'm not talking about wholesome response to the unacceptable. But what really is the outcome of holding on to ill will in our lives? Does it make us more friends? Does it make us more trusted? Does it make us more available? It doesn't help us to sleep at night. It doesn't help us to be more awake or more engaged or more connected, in my experience, with anything at all. So this quality of Mettā, befriending, begins in that classroom, not again, as I mentioned, in the outbursts of rage, but in those very small moments. What is it like to befriend, to be curious, to stand near to that voice of, that's kind of rebuking the world, that's blaming or shaming or judging? What's it really like to listen to those voices in those moments, to turn towards them rather than turn away from them, and a sense of what it is to befriend those stories and befriend those moments and befriend those voices rather than feeding the ill will. And this is perhaps one of those crucial choice moments. It's very easy to feed ill will, isn't it? We just need to throw quite a few more judgments and quite a few more thoughts on that fire, and pretty soon we're roaring and we're raging, and we're feeling self-righteous, and, we're feeling better than others, and we've worked ourselves into a frenzy of ill will. It's not hard to feed it. But this is one of those choice moments where we actually can learn to follow a different pathway, To read you a quote from the Buddha. It says, "One who dwells in Mettā with confidence in the Buddha's teaching attains the peaceful state, the blissful cessation of conditioning, nibbana." So when we speak about the insight factor of this quality of metta, clearly it's concerned with the toxicity of ill will in all its forms. And in the Buddhist teaching, ill will, aversion, however we want to phrase it, is seen to really have its roots in fear. The fear of injury, the fear of being harmed, the fear of loss, the fear of the unwelcome change, the fear of being out of control. That when we're faced with those situations in life, that often our first reaction is to push away, to get rid of, to annihilate, to distance ourselves. Which seems, of course, very human, except that it doesn't work. It's a basic flaw in this mechanism. It doesn't work. And the Buddha speaks of developing a way of being and a way of living that he speaks of as being fearless. It doesn't mean being sensitive to wise responses when we're faced with danger. It doesn't mean not jumping out of the way of a speeding bus or, a violent person, but a way where we're not governed by fear and ill will. Now, in my experience, ill will and aversion is really not just confined to human relationship. Certainly we can have difficult people in our lives, and we can meet difficult people on a daily basis. And we need to choose the wisest way to respond to that. But aversion doesn't have those confines, does it? We can be very aversive to, really unwelcome changes in our bodies. Aversive to pain, aversive to illness, aversion to aging, aversion to, the breakdown of the body, which quite frankly happens to us all. None of us are exempt. Which is why so often when I teach metta now, I very much center it around this phrase of in the midst of. In the midst of. In the midst of life's challenges, in the midst of life's difficulties, in the midst of life's uncertainties, where do I find a sense of ground? Where do I find a sense of refuge? It's not in ill will. It's not in aversion. This simply accelerates fear, creates more and more loneliness and lack of confidence in our own capacity to meet life. And metta, in my experience, really restores that sense of confidence. Yes, life is going to throw at us many, many things we don't welcome, we don't choose, and we don't control. Can I meet it without fear, without aversion? Which was why we cultivate, I think, in this very sustained way, this intentional way of being present. And actually, it begins, the best way to begin this cultivation is within the small moments. Not the huge, devastating, overwhelming moments that are, fearful or where we meet rage, but the very many small moments when we find ourselves turning away rather than turning towards. When we find ourselves thinking, well, it doesn't really matter if I have a little bout of jealousy or, a little bout of impatience and frustration. It actually really does matter. It really does matter. And we're often, when we're dealing with ill will, we're also dealing with, these very core discrepancies between how things are and how I am insisting on them being, how they should be. We're often dealing with these very core discrepancies that we actually don't know how to meet. And, when we're faced with the unwelcome, the unacceptable, how quickly that thought comes in, this shouldn't be happening. It has to be different. And maybe it does need to be different. I certainly wouldn't argue that. But getting caught in that gap, quite frankly, is an ocean of tears. It's just an ocean of tears. So metta is teaching us to meet life as it is. Very often when you see the traditional teachings of metta, or the practice of metta, you will see the encouragement, to begin with extending that sense of friendliness to yourself, to a good friend, to a benefactor, to a more neutral person, and to a more difficult person, and then to all beings. That's certainly the way that I was initially taught metta practice. And then I came to realize that for a lot of people, themselves are actually the most difficult person. That's the one where they have the biggest argument, I shouldn't be like this, I need to be better, I need to be kinder, I should be more compassionate, I should be like this, I don't like my thoughts, I don't like my body, I don't like all these things. Personally, I found myself really changing how I teach metta, because I think, just as we did in this sitting, there's so much importance about appreciating both the personal story and the universal story. The personal and the universal. That yes, I am asked to meet, an aging body or chronic illness or, dying. So too are you. So too are you. I am asked to, so I'm sometimes faced with, thoughts or emotions that I find very intrusive or unwelcome. So too, all of those around me. And then in the midst of this, that this doesn't have to go away in order for me to discover a kinder way of being. This is truly my classroom. This is where I begin, with befriending those moments when I see that inclination, that pattern of mind to lean towards resistance, denial, judgment, shame, blame. This is my classroom. There isn't a classroom outside of that. I find this very powerful as not just a meditation intention, but as a life intention. Very often, if we were going to go down the more traditional, and when I say traditional, it's not that old really, but the more traditional way of teaching metta, personally I think it's really important to begin in a place where there's a kind of unhesitating sense of gladness in connection with another. Someone you care about, or your dog, or your hamster, someone you feel an unhesitating affection for, Just begin with tasting, really tasting that sense of unhesitating kindness and care. I think it's so important to sense that ground, to really appreciate that capacity, that potentiality, and then to begin to move into these other domains of experience, but not to stay confined to human experience, but all of those life experiences, those life moments where the pattern of pushing away really does appear. In the midst of. During the, I personally, and many of you have heard me say this before, that I tend to have a life intention that I practice with for at least a year. And, because I feel that we can have just such overgeneralized intentionality just to be mindful, Well, good luck. The territory's too big. I find it much more helpful to be much more specific, both on the cushion and off the cushion. And, a few years ago, I made the intention not to have any more neutral people in my life. And that this was particularly important, I think, during the pandemic, where, we learned actually to be more distant. But, so many people come in and out of my life, the person at the cash register, the person on the psychopath, the person on the street, that I just don't see because I have no personal history with them, So therefore, I don't find them meaningful. And to have no more neutral people in my life. And it didn't mean that I followed people around with bursts of metta, But, to see someone, to actually see someone, and to have a sense of befriending and caring and appreciating, I found it to be quite a transforming practice. Metta means stepping out of our comfort zone, because although it can be deeply unpleasant to be caught in impatience and frustration and ill will, there's something very familiar about it, isn't there? And we get a lot of support from our world around us that this is kind of a normal way to be, Let's all rage together. And you've noticed how infectious aversion is? Whether it's the gossip circles at work, or whether, it's a joint collaborative moan about British Rail, or, whatever it is, or about some group of people, how infectious aversion is. But so too is metta. So too is befriending. And I think it is really important to have confidence in that. I personally don't feel that we can really afford ill will. I don't feel our planet can. I don't feel that our societies can. I don't feel that our families can. I don't think we can really afford ill will. And it takes actually, not just intention, but I think a real commitment to that intentionality. Befriending, addressing this core pattern. Before the break, someone offered a question. How do I face the ill will of others with the approach of friendliness, not turning away, and know it's not creating bitterness? It's a big question. How do I face the ill will of others when I feel blamed or judged or rejected or condemned in some way or even hated by another? I wish there was one simple formula. There isn't. Sometimes we need to assess our own level of resourcefulness in that moment. If we feel under-resourced, it's good to make distance. I've never found there's any value in being overwhelmed. Being overwhelmed just undermines us, undermines confidence. And there's a certain honesty, I think, in knowing when we are being overwhelmed and to create distance. And then we might need, one thing that I have learned in my life, and it's very much part of the equanimity teaching, is that I don't have the power to change the course of another person's mind. I can care for them, I can be honest, I can do everything that I can to address what's going on, but actually I don't actually have the power to change the course of another person's mind. It's in their hands. It is in their hands. I can do, as I say, I can offer everything that's possible to offer, but in the end, it is in their hands, just as somebody else doesn't have the power to change the course of my mind. Yeah? That too is in my hands. And I think acknowledging that can take some of the heat out of the argument, because so many of our arguments actually are about trying to change the course of another person's mind. If you were just a kinder person, or a more thoughtful person, a more considerate person, we'd all just get along swimmingly, wouldn't we? But I don't have the power to make you do this. Sometimes we learn to have the courage and the patience, sometimes to bear ill will, knowing it is born of another person's fear of injury. And sometimes we're not resourced enough to do that. And we need to make some distance, not forever, but there's sometimes a wisdom in saying, not this, not now. Not this, not now.